Good evening. Welcome to Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy. I am your host, Dr. Tracy Pearson. If this is the first time watching this show, welcome. And if you've watched our show before, well, welcome back. We're glad to have you back. So tonight, we have a really interesting show for you. It is timely, and it is on a topic that comes up in the news like a brush fire and then is quickly doused out. Anti-doping in sports and disparate treatment in that area of sports and athletics. We have guests that are at the top of their game who are going to help me understand these issues because they are completely outside my wheelhouse. I honestly have no knowledge about this area of law at all. So I'm going to trust my experts to teach me a little bit about how all of this works. One of the reasons why I do this show is I'm what you would call a philomath. It's a Greek word for someone who loves to learn. So tackling a topic that is unfamiliar to me is what I consider to be a good time. We all have our things, okay? So don't judge. If you've watched this show before, you probably know what I'm going to say next. So I have the DeLorean fired up, and I'm going to ask you to join me in a little jaunt back in time because the use of drugs in sports is not new. It's important to understand also that tonight I'm talking about amateur sports. Professional sports has its own issues and its own problem, its own thing going on. But right now, we're only looking at the amateurs. There was some brouhaha around the 1904 and 1908 Olympic Games, specifically related to marathons, where athletes were using stimulants. It was common to use cocaine and strychnine to help with performance. Cocaine needs no explanation, but strychnine may sound familiar to you if you like Agatha Christie novels, because it's a common plot element as a toxic poison. At very low doses, strychnine was believed to enhance performance, but not without side effects. Famously, in the 1904 Olympics, a track and field athlete, Thomas Hicks, downed a mixture of egg whites, brandy, and some strychnine. While he won the race, he arrived at the finish line hallucinating. Rather perfunctorily, in 1908, the Olympics issued a written statement forbidding the use of drugs during the race. But some in the medical community supported the use of substances to enhance performance. I mean, why not? If it could make you better, you should take advantage of scientific advancements, right? Those opposing such advantages saw the conduct as immoral and wanted to protect the purity of amateur sport. Slowly, ever so slowly, there was opposition to performance-enhancing drugs. In 1928, the International Association of Athletics Federations, the IAAF, formerly known as the International Amateur Athletics Association, issued a rule prohibiting what had become known as doping. The Olympics followed after in 1936. Now, in the book, Anti-Doping Crisis in Sport, Causes, Consequences, and Solution, it is stated that anti-doping was initially driven by a handful of men who held powerful elite positions, had careers within and outside sport, and had a sense of entitlement and leadership. Some of them had an interest in horse racing and no doubt took offense to the criminal underworld masterminding the corruption of races for the sake of material gain. They constructed doping as immoral, hoping perhaps it would disappear, but they failed to appreciate the appetite for performance enhancement among competitive athletes, and that without a definition and sufficient detection methods, the problem would only get worse. And in fact, it did in the long term. By the 1960s, the Olympics generated a list of banned substances, and top finishers took urine tests to test for stimulants. By the 1970s, sports saw a boom in the use of the form of steroids. There was hardly anything that the current system could do to get a handle on pharmaceutical performance enhancement that favored those with means and disadvantaged others. It wasn't until 1975 that a test was even developed to identify steroid use. In fact, subsequent testing of samples from the 1980 Moscow Olympics showed widespread doping, where athletes, even women, were using testosterone to fuel better performance. And positive test results were covered up at the 1984 Olympics. Attempts to beat the system included the following: timing dosages so that it wouldn't be detectable in the sample, substituting clean urine for dirty urine samples, using diuretics to try to mask the presence of steroids. Now, if that sounds like an average day in your local drug court, it was. Athletes were engaging in the same behaviors that drug addicts under court supervision were engaged in. I should know, I represented some of those folks. In 1985, Rolling Stone magazine broke a story about blood doping and US cycling. Blood doping involves using various substances or methods to increase the number of blood cells. And we're going to get into the medicine of this shortly. But in 1988, the first big doping case became world news. At the 1988 Olympics, Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson tested positive for anabolic steroids, and his gold medal was stripped, and the gold medal instead went to Carl Lewis. The IOC got ahead of their skis. They proclaimed that they had won the battle against doping. The International Olympic Committee had a hornet's nest on their hands, trying to identify performance-enhancing drugs, masking substances, locating and administering tests to identify all of the substances, and trying to administer a program that worked. In Switzerland, in 1999, the World Anti-Doping Agency was founded. You're going to hear reference to it tonight. I refer to it as WADA or WADA. It coordinates the anti-doping activities around the world, accredits labs, developed a code, and established the ultimate jurisdiction for disputes, which we're going to talk about a bit with one of our guests. What happened thereafter was a string of cases, but they were a drop in the bucket. In 2000, Marion Jones won 3 gold medals and 2 bronze medals at the Sydney Games. In 2007, she admitted to law enforcement that she had lied about her use of performance-enhancing drugs, and she went to jail for 6 months, and she was stripped of all of her medals. When you think of Lance Armstrong, you don't think of the Olympics. At least I don't. But he too lost a bronze medal from the 2000 Olympics as a result of a doping scandal. And that engulfed his career. Also in 2000, Andrea, and I'm gonna butcher this, and I apologize, Andrea Redicon, a gymnast and all-around gymnastics champion from Romania, tested positive for pseudoephedrine, which was in a cold remedy she received from a team doctor. In 1998, when snowboarding debuted as a sport at the Nagano Olympics, and I'm going to butcher this name too, and I apologize, Ross Rabiliotti tested positive for marijuana. And he initially lost his gold medal only to have it reinstated because there was no rule prohibiting the use of marijuana. With that new rule in place in 2020, Sha'Carri Richardson was disqualified from competing in the Tokyo Olympics as she tested positive for marijuana, now a banned substance. Sha'Carri Richardson has been in the news in light of the recent Olympic doping scandal, indirectly alleging that race played a role in how she was treated compared to the ROC skater Kamila Valieva. We reached out to Ms. Richardson and invited her to come on this show to tell her story and to discuss her allegations of racial animus. Through a representative, she declined. Due to a widespread government-sponsored doping program, after much litigation, Russia was sanctioned. Initially, that ban was for 4 years, but the Court of Arbitration of Sport decided to reduce that period to 2 years. Well, out of breath, we have now arrived safely being relative, of course, back in 2022. The latest in doping scandal happened during this Olympic cycle at the Beijing Winter Games, where Kamila Valieva, who competes for the Russian Olympic Committee as an ice skater, who was favored to win the individual gold medal and was part of the team to win the gold team medal, tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug. She seemingly should have been disqualified pending the outcome of her case, and the world would have moved on. But she wasn't. She was allowed to compete. Many former Olympic skaters were stunned. During the individual short program, commentators Tara Lipinski and Johnny Weir, both former Olympic skaters, were so overwhelmed by the decision that they hardly commented during Valieva's short program. One of Valieva's current competitors, Great Britain's Natasha McKay, said, "I wish it was a fair playing field, and it's not, but that's the decision they've made, and I can't do anything about it." The Court of Arbitration for Sport issued a preliminary order that allowed Valieva to compete. And in response, the IOC stated that should she medal, there would be no medal ceremony for that event, and there would be no medal ceremony for the team event where the ROC had taken gold, that no Olympic medals would be issued until the matter was resolved. The rationale for allowing her to compete was her age and what the arbitration panel called the risk of irreparable harm to her. And that was when I took notice. I had been casually watching the Olympics with my husband, commenting on which sports were real sports, which ones I questioned, and others that looked like sexual harassment cases in the making. Honestly, that speed skating relay mixed team event with the pushing, and of course, watching curling, because it's confusing and fascinating at the same time. But when an arbitration panel issued an order that took into account her age, essentially creating two standards of justice, and which led to irreparable harm to other athletes who deserved their moment in the spotlight, having presumptively followed the rules, the legal jargon, that got my attention. And it provoked my curiosity. Tonight, we're going to dig into these issues, and we have a number of guests on our program. My first guest this evening is going to help me understand the medicine involved. Dr. Martha Gulati is president-elect of the American Society for Preventive Cardiology. She was a professor of medicine and the inaugural chief of cardiology at the University of Arizona. Hi, Dr. Gulati. How are you doing? Welcome to Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. We do really appreciate it, because I got to tell you, the science behind this stuff is, has me confused at least. So let me ask you a few questions. I trust doctors, and I need some help in sort of understanding some of this stuff, because I think that it can be complicated and there's a lot of conjecture going on in the news. There were 3 substances that were disclosed and 1 medication that was not. I'm going to list them. I'm going to butcher them. My ability to pronounce names of things tonight is gone. I'm electric sliding toward the weekend. Let's just put it that way. It's Thursday, and these words sometimes are hard. Hypoxin, L-carnitine, Supradin, and this is the one that gets me, trimetazidine. Did I get it right? Trimetazidine.
You did.
Okay,
And
I get the gold
for
medal.
sure, in Europe, where this is more prevalent, it's not in America. They refer to it as TMZ, which I think is a television station or a television show. So you can refer to it as that.
Okay, that's going to make things easier for me tonight. So, one by one, can you tell me what these substances are? Let's
Yeah,
start with the first one, hypoxin.
yeah. Hypoxin is not entirely clear to any of us what it is. It's not available in the US. It's only made by a Russian company. Yeah, apparently people can get it online, but what exactly it is, it hasn't been peer reviewed, which is how when we look at any drug or even over the counter supplements, we need to know what's in them, but it at least if you read what they write about it, is that it potentiates cell metabolism. And it is at least considered to some people that it should be considered on the banned list because it also proclaims and is sold to athletes. Actually, it's marketed to athletes to increase oxygen consumption and increase performance by its potential mechanism. Again, this is saying this without me being able to go and look at some medical journal where they've studied the drug.
Can you explain? And I'm gonna do this a lot probably during our conversation, but explain what cell metabolism is.
Yeah, it's the well, every cell has to, create in order to function. It metabolizes just like humans metabolize the food we eat. It's different food that our cells need, but it's often what we ingest. And we have something inside the cell that's our energy maker called the mitochondria, if people really want me to go into that much detail. But basically it does all the work. It's if you want the furnace of it, it is, it produces all the energy. And if something targets that, the mitochondria, then it really is increasing the function. And that at least is the way that hypoxin says that it works. That's what as they market it, that's the way that they say it.
Okay. How about L-carnitine?
Yeah, so L-carnitine is a supplement. We actually have it naturally in our bodies as well. But L-carnitine, there had been interest in it from a heart aspect, and I am a cardiologist. It had been of interest to us in people who we couldn't relieve their angina with our traditional medications, and specifically actually for people with small vessel disease where we really didn't know how to treat them. We still don't really know how to treat that particular disease. But what we know is that in the body naturally, L-carnitine increases the amount of oxygen that's available to our blood vessels to dilate, and therefore increases the function of our heart. So we naturally make it. We have done some trials where we've used L-carnitine without much success, to be honest with you. We don't know if it's just by giving it orally, it doesn't work the same way. Maybe it has to be targeted within certain parts of our body and certain parts of our cells. And maybe we're not getting it there by giving simply a supplement. But it's interesting that there's still a lot of athletes all over the world that take L-carnitine. You can buy it in your, drugstore, supplement store, and it markets it that it's going to improve your performance. So there is a lot of athletes. Like anytime I see an athlete, whether they're college or, professional, lots of them take L-carnitine thinking, it's marketed really well. And so that at least raises anyone's eyebrow when somebody's taking some of this cocktail. You're like, oh, you're taking hypoxin and you're taking L-carnitine. These are things targeted to athletes to improve performance. Now, neither of those, like you said, neither of them are on the ban list. So she admitted, this athlete admitted actually on her list of things she takes, those two things.
What about Supradin?
Yeah, that, as best as I know, is a supplement and a vitamin, like a multivitamin. And that in and of itself has no there's no literature saying it is a performance drug. So whether it gives people more energy or not is, everybody's best guess. If it's just expensive urine, that might be it too.
Um, and then TMZ, we're going to call it TMZ for the sake of me tonight. What does that do?
So TMZ is not available in the United States. People should know that. But in Europe, and in Russia, it's very common. The drug, we have a similar drug called Renexa, or ranolazine is the generic name, and it seems to be very similar. I'll say every cardiologist in the United States will tell you they're less familiar with TMZ because we can't prescribe it. It's not available here, but it's usually given twice a day to people who have what we call chronic angina. So they have blockages in their arteries, also known as atherosclerosis, and all the other drugs, people that we give, that some of them are like nitrates that people put under their tongue to increase oxygen. If those don't work, we might use this drug if all the other drugs are not working, at least in Europe. We again, the similar sister medication in the United States works a little bit differently. But TMZ, what it does to the body is it tells us to use, specifically the heart, it tells the heart not to use fatty acids to metabolize, but to use glucose, sugar, basically. That's quicker for the body. It means it will increase the amount of oxygen that the body is getting, and the heart specifically. And that can actually be, for somebody with heart disease, can be very beneficial potentially. I will say that, again, I'm a scientist, so there's papers written about this, and this is one that's been peer reviewed and even published in the Lancet, which is a big journal for us in the medical world. And they have not actually shown that it's that effective in doing what we need it to do for patients with heart disease. But it's kind of a last resort, where you've used everything and you're still suffering, you're still having chest pain or chest pressure. Okay, we're going to try this and see if it relieves you. For a young person, we don't know what that should do to anyone who's healthy, let me say, first of all. But then to young people, it's not recommended for people under the age of 18. It's not been studied in people under the age of 18. So, and additionally, I'd be hard pressed to say that a 15-year-old, especially a competitive athlete, has some sort of underlying heart condition that would require that medication. I mean, you can certainly be born with other heart conditions or even develop heart conditions. Atherosclerosis, it would be very surprising to see that in somebody. The drug is good. I mean, for patients who, especially again, our heart patients, in the sense that it doesn't lower blood pressure much, which might be a limitation for some of our heart patients who's, we're already treating their blood pressure, and their blood pressure, that's part of our treatment. But when you get it to a certain point, you can't add in other drugs. This drug's a nice one that you can add in because it doesn't lower your blood pressure any further and make people pass out or feel dizzy on it. And it also doesn't lower the heart rate. And so sometimes for patients already on cardiac drugs, this is a good thing. Now, if you're a normal person with a normal blood pressure and a normal heart rate, you probably don't want any drug as well to lower your blood pressure or lower your heart rate. Which again, there has been people that have used this drug in different ways, many athletes as well. And that's the reason it's being given as well, because it doesn't lower your blood pressure. It doesn't lower your heart rate in the same way that other medications might. And that matters for an athlete because obviously, or anybody, because you don't want to feel lightheaded or dizzy.
Especially when you're jumping and doing spins in space. I mean, I remember with Simone Biles, her getting what she called them, the spins, where she lost where she was in space and time as she was doing these maneuvers. And I can't imagine if you're jumping that you'd want to get dizzy or have that potentiality.
Well, this skater was doing quadruple jumps and landing them. You certainly, I am actually a former figure skater, so I know even I could never do those kind of jumps, but you do feel a little bit dizzy. That's part of the thing, is you've got to land it and you've got to get your bearings and get back and moving. And so this again, again, do I know her medical records? Do I know her medical conditions? No. Apparently, from what was reported, um, she wasn't actually taking this drug, is the report, that she thinks that she might have gotten it from her grandfather, who apparently is on it, and that maybe she sipped water, or I don't know what the exact excuse was, but we do know now that she had about 2.1 nanograms per milliliter. That was the measured amount in her urine. And that is not sort of a just sipping out of the same glass of water type of dose. We know that because there was an American athlete, and I hope I get her name right, but I think Madeline Cox. And she was actually, I think, discovered to have this in her system. And she was a swimmer, and she was actually banned initially for, I think, for 2 years, and they shortened it because she didn't know how it got in her system. And ultimately there was some sort of drink that she was taking that had this in it. They actually tested it and found that whatever she was taking, it was called Cooper's Complete Elite Athletic Multivitamin, and she was taking that. She had no idea, but once they measured it, didn't list it on it, but once they measured it in it, they did find this medication actually in there.
That's amazing.
But at smaller amounts than when she was taking it, at much smaller amounts than this athlete currently that we're discussing. And so we think that this dose is rather high for somebody who's saying, I might have just incidentally either taken it or drank water, because the half-life of this drug can range anywhere from 7 hours to 12 hours in our body. But you have to take it twice a day. If you're prescribed it, it's a twice a day drug, and it's because it wears off quite quickly, and it's cleared by our kidneys, meaning we pee it out. So the urine is a good place to test for it, and it's really measuring exactly the drug because it doesn't get metabolized by the body. So based on what my understanding is, the amount seen in her urine is more than just sort of an incidental passage. This, to me, either suggests that you were chronically taking it or you just took it relatively recently.
Is there a way to sort of backtrack or reverse engineer it to try to figure out how often she was taking it? I mean, is one dose enough to do that to someone at that level, or do you need to take it for an extended period?
It seems not necessarily extended. You could have taken it, but taken it recently. My understanding, she was tested on December 25th, was the day that the sample was taken. And I know, it's not a holiday in Russia like it is in the United States, because they celebrate Christmas on the Orthodox calendar. So, but I don't know, I think temporally somebody would need to tell us, when did she see her grandfather? When did she actually take it? It seems rather high for, even if it was the day before, it would have been out of her system, we would think, by that point, if it was the day before.
And this is a drug that isn't distributed or made in the US. Is there a reason for that?
I'm not entirely sure on that side. We may have been that this drug was developed at the same time that another drug was being developed by an American manufacturer. That was that drug called ranolazine, and maybe they felt like, drug companies are really smart. Where do they have the market? And so they may have okay, the European market is where we'll go. This drug ranolazine is still in the market in the United States, and again is used very similarly to TMZ. But I can't answer that. For both of these drugs, they're kind of like, to some degree, a last resort drug. So there may not be a market enough for two drugs. That may be the rationale why it never came here, because our European colleagues do use it, and I believe that it was developed in France, if I remember correctly. So I don't know why, but I mean, I will tell you, athletes are aware of this drug, and it always concerns us because if they're looking for performance enhancing drugs, we just don't know the effect of these on people that are healthy. And I also think for children, and this athlete to me is a child, the long-term effect, if you are taking it long term, that I don't know what the effect is. But again, a healthy person, a young person, I it frustrates us because we see this when kids want to excel in their sports, and if they're given something, even if they're given it by their coaches, you know it's their long-term health that really should be the priority, and we're seeing that isn't, we aren't protecting the children. I get that they said that the reason that they're not really punishing this young woman is because they're trying to protect her. I would say they should protect her from if she was taking this drug, whoever's giving her this drug.
Is this, and again, we understand things in terms of our own experiences. We sort of center our own experiences and world. So in Europe, where this drug is disseminated, is it something that requires a prescription, or can it just be bought over the counter?
It's a prescription drug, so it is not over the counter.
Okay. Now, what I understand, and again, there's limited information coming out, but it's coming out in drips and drabs, is that the grandfather purportedly takes this drug as something he takes periodically for what he called attacks. Is that consistent with the drug's dosing and usage?
Well, you can never say how a physician decides to prescribe these drugs, but in general, I would say that's not the traditional way of prescribing it. If you know somebody is living with chronic angina, which usually means they're experiencing on an almost daily basis chest pain or chest discomfort that is believed to be due to blockages in the heart arteries, you would prescribe it as we would the drug that we said is available in the US, Renexa. We would prescribe it as a chronic thing, to take it every day. This particular drug, to take it twice a day. And that is the way to reduce these attacks of angina and be able to let somebody know that they can function normally. For some people, the way that they experience angina, they walk a short distance and they'll get chest pressure. And we don't want them to. We want to keep our heart patients active and without chest discomfort, because chest discomfort scares every heart patient. It's not like the drugs that maybe some people are familiar with, sublingual nitroglycerin, the type that we put under the tongue when you're really uncomfortable and you're about to making a decision. Should I call 911? Should I get to the hospital because this is I can't relieve this. We do give that to patients, but you know why people don't take it on a regular basis is it does dramatically lower the blood pressure. It's kind of a last resort. You take it as needed, so up to 3 pills. And if you have to take the third pill, you call the ambulance because it's not going away. And it gives you massive headaches, because that's what nitrates do. They give you massive headaches and they're not comfortable. And it's one of the hard parts of treating acute chest pain is the use of nitroglycerins. We can give it by IV as well. And we have the same patients going, oh my God, what did you do? I have a massive headache. And then we're treating the headache as well as the chest pain. But in general, this drug that we're talking about, TMZ, you should be taking it continuously. It's not really what we call PRN, take it as you need it type of drug. So I can never say never. That some doctor said you can pop it when you need it. I know things like that do happen, within our medical community, thinking, okay, it's okay, because there's not a lot of evidence that it improves outcomes per se. But if it improves somebody's angina, they might say, okay, that's when you use it. Hard to know.
I'm thinking about, it's very hard to appreciate her size from the TV. But given the height that she gets on jumps and given how many rotations she can do, she strikes me as probably very small, possibly very short, and obviously very light. Is there any concern about having taken this drug and her body weight, never mind her age? How is it prescribed? Is it prescribed based on body weight, or is there just a standard dose?
Sadly, it's a complete different issue, but these medications are studied usually in adults. So the one thing is that, and the one thing you'll learn about adult drugs is we never dose them in general the same way as pediatric drugs. Pediatric drugs are very weight based, and so if you're a certain weight, we know how to do the calculation. For adults, and I'm an adult doctor, we don't calculate anything. Drugs for women and men are the same, even when women are sometimes half the size. It's my pet peeve, but I will go on that rampage right now.
We'll have you back to talk about that issue on a different show.
But the biggest thing is no, we don't know. The studies that approved this drug showed its use as a simple dose, and the dose is the same regardless of size. I believe it's, again, I don't prescribe this every day or at all because it's not available here, but I believe it's like 35 milligrams, and it doesn't matter on body size. It probably, for smaller people, let's be honest, it's metabolized by the kidneys, and metabolism is very minimal. So until it gets cleared by the kidneys, we have to believe that in smaller people, the steady state dose of the drug will be higher, just because that's how we know how this drug is metabolized, but the dosing is the same.
Now you work with adults, and so you also work with adult athletes, and so you've got a bit of a stage here to share a message. If that's something you'd like to do, what do you wish that parents and coaches and teachers understood about what you do and about the impacts of decisions on the health of folks who are in athletics?
Yeah, my biggest message to parents and to coaches, our first job is to protect our children and even our young adults from being given medications that perhaps may not be beneficial. Things like L-arginine, I always tell people it's expensive urine. You're just peeing it out. It really doesn't have the performance enhancing that you think it does. But then there can be dangerous drugs as well that can affect the health of our children and our young athletes. I think our first job is to protect them. It's not about winning medals. It's not about winning the game. And I think we need to take that responsibility a lot more seriously. I think when people are of a certain age and they make decisions to put things in their body, even with informed decisions, that's their choice. But I think when we do it to children, I don't blame this young athlete if she was taking it. But who's giving it to her? Who's telling a 15-year-old to take L-carnitine or hypoxin, or if she was taking TMZ? Who is giving her that cocktail? That's a cocktail that is used by athletes, and saying that this is okay or safe. We don't know that it's okay or safe. And this is where sports harm our children rather than be the great thing that it should be. I mean, Olympics, I'm a Canadian by birth. I love the Winter Olympics because we actually win medals in this one. But I grew up loving sports, watching it through the eyes of amazing athletes. And it's still a beautiful thing. And all the things that she's achieved are beautiful, but they've all disappeared now. There's not one of us now watching her, just like the commentators that you mentioned, going, I can barely watch this. And that's sad because she is a gifted and talented individual.
Thank you. Dr. Martha Gulati. She's the president-elect of the American Society for Preventive Cardiology. She was a professor of medicine and the inaugural chief of cardiology at the University of Arizona. Thank you so much for being here on Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy. And I hope that I can steal you back one of these days when we need your expertise.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Oh, I learned a lot about cardiology and about those medicines. I got to tell you, I've been scratching my head all day trying to figure out, what were they and why would somebody be giving those to this person? So I'm glad that she was here to be able to help me figure that out. Our next guest tonight is Lindsay Brandon. She is an attorney with the law offices of Howard Jacobs here in California. Attorney Brandon practices in an athlete's as an athlete's lawyer at one of the preeminent sports law firms in the country. Now, Howard Jacobs was scheduled to be here. However, an emergency, and I'm not kidding you, it involved an Olympic case, so an Olympic emergency, it made it so that he was unable to be here. And so this is what happens when you do a show about anti-doping in sports during the Olympics. That's on me on that. But I, as I said to Lindsay before the show, I think he owes me one. So I'm going to get him back here, I swear. But we are happy to have Attorney Brandon here, and I want to welcome you to Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'll try to do as well as Howard, but we'll see.
I am certain that you will do just fine. So I have a load of questions, and given that I am an attorney myself, there are going to be all sorts of questions that I'm going to ask you. I know nothing about how this works. I mean, I'm able to sort of draw some conclusions here and there about how it works. But, even looking through the history of how this stuff works, it's my understanding that WADA created this basically this arbitration, this court of arbitration with panelists. Is that correct? Am I understanding that?
So the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is seated in Switzerland, is actually, it hears cases related to all types of sports disputes. It's not just related to doping. There is an anti-doping division. Now, during the Olympics, however, CAS sets up a special ad hoc division for the Olympic Games. And so they designate a certain number of arbitrators, appointed arbitrators, that go to the Olympics and then are there to hear the types of cases like what we just saw with Camila Valieva's case. Excuse me.
Now I'm gonna drill this down to basics because folks watching may not even know what an arbitrator is. What's an arbitrator?
So an arbitrator is an independent adjudicator. Typically with anti-doping cases, it's a panel of 3 arbitrators, or the best way I can describe it is like a judge. There's a president of the panel that's appointed by CAS, and then typically, if outside of the ad hoc division, there would be an arbitrator selected by the anti-doping agency, or in other words, what you might think of as the prosecutor in a case, and then the athletes council would get to select an arbitrator. So, their function is, and for those not familiar with arbitration, it is sort of like court. It functions similarly in procedures, but it is more informal when it comes to things like the rules of evidence and witness testimony.
How do are these arbitrators volunteers or are they paid? And do you know that?
They're compensated. Most arbitrators, I'll say this, there's a long list. If you go to the Court of Arbitration for Sport website, they have a catalog of all all of the arbitrators that have been qualified and appointed. You have to be appointed and approved by CAS to serve as an arbitrator. But the actual list of arbitrators that have heard cases is a much shorter list. And those individuals are typically people that have a background in sports law or international arbitration. And so you often see the same arbitrators turn up again and again on these, in particular, anti-doping cases, because they've built a jurisprudence for themselves through various rulings.
Did you recognize the names of the arbitrators that were who issued this decision?
I did recognize at least one name, the American arbitrator on that case is a friend of mine. Yes.
Okay. No, and that's fine. I'm just curious because you said they turn up quite a bit. So how does one of these cases start?
So I guess it depends, right? Because traditionally the way that anti-doping is supposed to work is that, at the elite level, athletes are tested both in and out of competition. They're subjected to what's called whereabouts requirements, where they have to input their whereabouts every day of the year in a calendar so that they can be tested at random anytime. And so, testing occurs at any time. And if a test comes up positive, then, there's a process that's kicked into gear. And that usually, hopefully, involves an athlete obtaining representation, because regardless of their, fault in the matter, this process is a difficult one to navigate. I think the nuance of the Valieva case has made that pretty clear. And then, the athlete is entitled to have their B sample tested to confirm whether or not they had a positive test in their A sample. And sometimes during that point, depending on what substance the athlete tested positive for, they'll either be automatically provisionally suspended, or they have the option to accept a provisional suspension.
Now, I'm gonna drill down just a little bit more detail.
Sure.
So I'm familiar with the A/B sample from DWI cases. When you blow, in a intoxilizer, you get 2 samples. And so, but when this whereabouts calendar, so they have to put in their whereabouts wherever they are, so that, is it somebody comes and shows up to give them the test, or is it that a coach is instructed to give them the test? How does that work?
No, that is all done by the appropriate anti-doping organizations in the jurisdiction of the athlete. So, for example, U.S. athletes use this application that was designed by the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency called Athletes Express. Most athletes globally use what's called ATOMS, which is software designed by the World Anti-Doping Agency, where they input their calendar information. And regardless of where they are on any given day in the world, if they're an elite athlete and in the registered testing pool, a doping control officer from the region that they're in, whether it be the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency or the International Testing Agency, or, RUSADA for that matter, can show up to their hotel or their apartment or house and request a sample from them. And that, you mentioned earlier in your show the timing of doping, right? That's what this is designed to prevent, because if athletes are only tested in competition, then that sort of defeats the purpose of the anti-doping movement.
Right. Before, it used to be that they, at least when it first started, they would test them after. If you won, they would test you to see if you had cheated.
Sure.
And they got around that. They decided, no, better not to do that. Much better process is to test people periodically. So what sort of, if you're familiar, what sort of controls are put in place? I think of sort of evidence, it's evidence collection in essence. So someone shows up, asks for a sample, and you give the sample. What happens if you refuse? And then what also happens is they pick a lab nearby that's been accredited by WADA is where it gets delivered, and what sort of protections are in place to protect the sample from contamination?
Sure. So test refusal is a big no-no. If you refuse to submit a sample for collection, that's punishable by a 4-year anti-doping sanction. So, I know there have been cases like the Sun Yang case where there's questions about the validity of the doping control officer and whether or not it's a real, um, somebody that's representing to be a doping control officer is actually the person and they have the accreditation to prove that. But assuming everything goes smoothly and it is a real, what we call a DCO showing up and they collect the sample, then it's typically sent to the closest WADA accredited laboratory. And what I mean by that is that the labs that test these samples have to go through a process by which they're approved by the World Anti-Doping Agency to test these samples based on a certain set of rigorous requirements, testing standards they're all set forth in this very long document called the International Standard for Testings and Investigations, and that's on the WADA website for anybody who's interested in a really riveting read. But
You can't sleep. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I guess, and I'm not entirely sure of the status of laboratories in Russia, but for Valieva's sample, for example, it's possible that it was sent to Stockholm because that was the closest WADA accredited laboratory that could test it.
Okay. And so, I mean, this would probably be more suitable for a medical doctor, but the sample hopefully doesn't degrade in the time that it takes to get it to Stockholm or wherever it needs to go, because that would be depriving someone of evidence in theory.
Yeah, I don't think there's evidence to suggest. I mean, certainly there's the standards set forth, means by which it has to be collected, and that the bottles that the samples have to be collected in that preserve the sample. And if there's any evidence of destruction or tampering when the samples arrive, then that has to be addressed because that could be grounds to throw out the sample altogether.
So now the sample gets to the lab, and let's assume that it tests positive. Now, the first thing that I sort of noticed in this case involving this skater was that there was a delay in reporting that information to somebody. So what happens when it tests positive?
Sure. So once the A sample is confirmed, and that's done by a very long chain of custody and vigorous testing requirements. They're all delivered with the notification to the athlete. Whatever testing agency that's conducting what's called the results management, so who's collecting it, testing it, and doing the notification, will contact the athlete or their representative on file and let them know we detected either, some substances you can test positive for and have what's called an atypical finding, which is, hey, we think, this is common in meat contamination cases if there's very low levels of banned substances that are known to be in livestock, for example, and an athlete tests positive in an area where they've been consuming livestock known to be treated with that, they may say, hey, this is an atypical finding. In Miss Valieva's case, that was an adverse analytical finding because it was for a substance that is banned at all times. And as the medical professional that you had on explained, at a level, that's not insignificant.
Okay. And so the athlete is notified in some manner, either through a representative or directly.
Mm-hmm.
And is it their responsibility to then notify somebody?
So when the athlete is notified, the testing agency will notify the athlete's relevant doping agency, their national governing body, the international governing body, as well as the World Anti-Doping Agency. So everyone receives a copy of this letter of notification, putting them on notice that this is going on.
And so in this case, there was a delay in notification. Is that correct?
Yes, that's our understanding.
Is that common?
It's not uncommon to see a delay of that period of time, but that's typically in cases where, the athlete was tested out of competition, not where you're testing in competition in a national competition, a qualification event for the Olympics. Those samples have to be prioritized and tested well before the Olympics so that when something like this happens, it's adjudicated or dealt with in a timely manner so you don't end up with the situation like what we're seeing. Exactly.
Right. And so this officer comes and takes a sample. Is it the officer's responsibility to indicate this is a priority sample that needs to be tested, or does the lab somehow discern that on its own?
The testing agency, and this is talked about a little bit in the reasoned decision that came out today. The testing agency is responsible to ensure that this is done in a timely manner. They know when the sample is collected. It has to be, it's typically sent via FedEx or whatever overnight delivery to the laboratory. And there's an understanding that these samples will be accepted, go through the chain of custody and tested in a timely manner to produce a result, because there is a provision in the code that actually, it's called delays not attributable to the athlete, where the athlete can benefit in the long term when they deal with their sanction about delays in their case that were not their fault. And that's been a big issue in this Valieva case.
Let me ask a question from a devil's advocate perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The delay notwithstanding, I mean, let's assume that the test was genuine, that it, everything met requirements beyond the delay. It was her sample, and that banned substance is found in her urine. What does a delay matter if in fact it was there?
So in this case, it's because she's in the middle of competing at the Olympics, right? Mm-hmm. You brought up the Sha'Carri Richardson matter, and that's, I think, a difficult thing to compare in terms of the underlying issues of race and bias in these things. In this particular case, Valieva's sample should have been handled like Miss Richardson's was. It should have been tested promptly and reported before the start of the Olympics. The implications of the delay then becomes, you've had an athlete who has a positive test and under any other circumstances would have been provisionally suspended in the middle of competition. And now you have athletes that aren't getting their medals awarded to them because they need to know the outcome of her doping case before they can do that.
Now, let me shift then to, she's 15 years old, and I understand there's a term called she's a protected person. Is that correct? Am I using that term right?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So this is a new concept that's been added to the latest version of the World Anti-Doping Code. This, I think, had good intentions to create provisions for athletes under the age of 16, which Miss Valieva is, who find themselves in circumstances of a positive test, under the presumption that, you know, they're basically kids and they might not have the same cognitive capacity to appreciate all of the precautions and responsibilities that go into anti-doping.
Okay. I used to practice juvenile law. I mean, I practiced a lot of different areas, but this was the one that I didn't practice in, right?
I did too, actually.
And so I understand this concept of, you know, juvenile justice and using it as a teaching mechanism, not necessarily as a punitive hammer, but I mean, we're talking elite athletes. You know, they're training at, you know, possibly on teams with other athletes that are older than them. They're at such a high level. They've worked their way up through these various, you know, categories and classes, and they've you know, had so many competitions. And I'm just having a hard time buying this concept of, you know, they don't appreciate, you know, the ramifications of what's happening here. Am I being overly cynical? Is it my old lawyer brain that's kicking in here, or I mean, is this reality? Or help me out.
Well, no, I think it cuts both ways, right? Because certainly you have, watching the broadcast of Miss Valieva's skate, you have Tara Lipinski commenting on how she was that age and subject to the same rules, and she understood her responsibilities. But at the same time, you can understand where someone like Miss Valieva might be coerced or impressed upon by coaches or trainers, and so, you know, when we look at what's called an athlete's degree of fault in terms of their anti-doping rule violation, are they entitled to a lesser violation because their culpability is just lesser than an elite adult athlete? Now that, and I apologize if I'm going off on a tangent here, but
No, please.
if it's discovered that, you know, the source of this positive test was not her grandfather, as she's saying, and it's because somebody in her camp gave her this medication, they would be subject to the same anti-doping rules, and they would potentially face a harsher penalty than Miss Valieva.
So somebody that, and I'm not saying that this is the case, there's no evidence that this is the case, there's no allegation that this is the case. I want to be really clear, but that one of her teammates could have slipped her this drug at some point, and she could, and that's why she tested positive, and they profited from that by getting a gold medal, let's say. Is that sort of a hypothetical that you're thinking?
I mean, no, what I was thinking more of was her trainers and coaches and nutritionists basically saying, here's a cocktail of supplements that you should take. It's safe to take. It won't cause a positive test. It'll help you with recovery and stamina and so on and so forth. And that happens every day, right? It doesn't always result in a doping offense. That's more what I'm envisioning. Is sabotage something that has been known to happen? Sure, but it's also not a defense to a doping violation. You know, there's strict liability. That's what the code is designed under, and so ultimately, you as an athlete are responsible for everything that goes into your body, even if it ends up there accidentally.
Okay, and that's for protected persons as well as adult athletes?
Correct.
So help me now. Now I think I'm following everything that you're saying. Help me understand why her age was relevant then in the deciding of not to suspend her. I don't understand what value the age had if there's strict liability.
Sure. So this was really fascinating, right? So under the WADA code, if you test positive for a non-specified substance, there's different classifications of substances. In her case, it was a metabolic modulator that's banned at all times. That you are automatically subject to a provisional suspension. That just goes into effect. You can challenge that, but only on the basis of if the athlete can demonstrate to a hearing panel that the source of the positive test was likely a contaminated product, or it was a substance of abuse and the athlete can show that they're entitled to a reduction in sanction, ultimately in a hearing on the merits, which we haven't seen in Valieva's case, right? So
Right.
The strange thing here, I mean, I think the Russian anti-doping agency was right to impose a provisional suspension upon her under this rule because, it kicked in, right? But then there's this argument about a contaminated substance. She appeals this to the RUSADA appeal board in the middle of the Olympics and says, well, it was contamination. And I think, one, that's up for debate because a contaminated product is not by definition an accidental ingestion of a medication belonging to somebody else. But two, there's this concept of proportionality that comes into play. And so that's where her designation as a protected person matters, right? Because under the new rules, in a hearing on the merits of her case, instead of the applicable sanction being up to 4 years, it's anywhere from a reprimand to 2 years. And if she can demonstrate based upon the facts, as it appears that she did before this RUSADA appeal board, that she's not likely to receive a substantial sanction based upon the facts, that she's entitled to a lifting of the provisional suspension. And the CAS ad hoc tribunal agreed with that logic. And the reason they did that is because they interpreted this imposition of the provisional suspension differently. They said that that the WADA code is actually silent with respect to the provisional suspension imposition on protected persons. Like, they just, to put it in lay terms, they screwed up when they wrote this, when they envisioned this idea of a protected person. And so there's actually a gap in the application of the rule. And it can't be that you have this envisionment of a protected person being subject to a lesser penalty and also not being entitled to electing whether or not to have a provisional suspension imposed upon them.
But yet the potential sanction she could have been facing was a reprimand up to 2 years of suspension. So I don't consider being, prevented from competing for up to 2 years as being a limited or lesser suspension. I know that it can go longer. I know that it can be permanent. But I just don't understand how that was treated so insignificantly. My understanding, I understood the contaminated product explanation that you provided, which is that an accidental ingestion is not the same thing as contaminated. And so it seems as if potentially it fails there. It's strict liability, so it's in her body. Mm-hmm. And we know what those drugs are designed to do. She admitted to some of them, and those are fine. They're not banned, but there's this one, and it's the one that everybody knows is sort of used for this purpose. And then I ran across, and I wasn't able to verify the authenticity of this, but I'm going to talk about it because it was interesting to me that there was a document. It was the appeal document from WADA, where it laid out sort of the evidence that she did present and what she didn't present. There was no prescriptions presented on behalf of the grandfather. There was the only testimony they got was from a video in a car where he sort of waved around a box that could have been anything. We've got a family member claiming she has heart. I can't remember the term. It's like aberrations, or there's something there, and that that's why she was taking this or taking something, one of those supplements. That there's, and there was a lot of discussion in this document about just sort of the definition of what a contaminated product is. I mean, a lot of time was spent on it. So I'm still sort of trying to process, and maybe you can help me understand sort of, did these guys get it wrong? Did they get it wrong? I mean, what's the burden of proof? Is it beyond, is it by preponderance? Is it clear and convincing? What is it?
So in terms of the contaminated product concept, that they actually discussed in this reasoned award on the decision to stay the provisional suspension, that the Russian anti-doping rules actually seem to suggest a higher standard, but that could just be a bad translation in Russian. But it's whether it's likely to have been the source. So, on a balance of probabilities, was this likely the source of the positive test? I think that's extremely up for debate, and that is certainly going to be vigorously adjudicated in the hearing on the merits before the Court of Arbitration for Sport. I think the important thing to remember with what's going on in the ad hoc case is that they were simply asked whether or not, under the rules, it made sense to either uphold the provisional suspension or not. And they justified their decision by saying, look, there's a potential serious detriment to this athlete if we don't allow her to continue to compete in these games. A lot of that was based upon the fact that they said, anti-doping agencies and their results management, if we're going to hold these athletes to such a high standard, then they have to be held to the same ones. And they didn't take very much solace in the fact that WADA said it's not unusual for tests to take 40 days. They said, well, that's not acceptable in an instance where you're testing athletes who are going to go to the Olympics. That should have been done and dealt with, and then we wouldn't be here in the first place. They were very clear about the fact that they were not making any assessment as to the credibility of the source of the positive test, but rather that, what led us to the situation that we're in, right? And how much of the fault was that of the athletes. And in reality, they were right that it's not her fault that this is happening now. But, she's certain to be found to have committed an anti-doping rule violation just by virtue of the substance being in her system.
Now, let me ask you this question. In regular court world, we have, this concept of, a third party interest. And the thing that had caught my attention about this was that the IOC had made some determinations that, well, fine, if you're going to let her compete, we're going to hold off having a medal ceremony if she ends up, earning a medal in the individual competition. And we're not going to have a medal ceremony for the team portion of the competition that had just happened, because we need to find out the outcome. And I don't know the number. I don't know how many are on a team. Again, this is so outside my wheelhouse. And then there's also, there's these, at least there's three places. So 3 people, potentially, because there'd be the 4th person on the other side who might make it up onto the medal stand. There's that many people who may be impacted by the idea that she would be potentially medal in the competition, and in the harm done to those people who have a right to their moment, the harm done to the sport itself, and to the idea of we're just going to let somebody compete who may be cheating, for lack of a better term, whether based on that strict liability standard, let's say. And it seems as if they just gave no consideration whatsoever to all those is interests. And so is that part of the process? Is that really part of that system? Or is that ever come into play? Because it just seems so incredibly unfair. And I think that's what we were hearing from, former competitors, Tara Lipinski and Johnny Weir in particular, but others, and current competitors, of Ms. Valieva, that this wasn't fair, but there wasn't anything that she could do about it. And then, obviously with Tara Lipinski and Johnny Weir being just so incredibly upset about this, obviously they were during a different time of rule, I think. But do they take into consideration any of that, or is it really solely focused on just that one party that's in front of them?
I think certainly decisions are colored with that in mind, but unfortunately, at the end of the day, often the most important stakeholders in this decision-making process, which are these other athletes that are waiting to find out when they'll get their medals, it's not a factor here, because the issue before, there's the issue of the provisional suspension first and foremost, but then secondly, it's whether there was an anti-doping rule violation committed. And so the panel weighed, if she is found to be at the low end of the fault spectrum and her sanction ends up being less than, the time period in between her positive test and the date of the Olympics, then she would be irreparably harmed if she's a medal contender, and unable to continue to compete at these games. Or if, say, we strip her of her gold medal now by saying she should have been provisionally suspended during this period of time, and there's disqualification of results. So, it really is a tight balance, and it's often, I think, when you look at a lot of the press that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency does, they're the biggest mouthpiece for these athletes that are affected by this, right? And that's why the issue of Russia even being allowed to compete in the Olympics in the first place was so contentious, because, have they really, a lot of people will look at this and say they haven't earned the trust of the global sport community, and look what's happened. They've created an entire sideshow here at the Olympics and deprived everybody else of their moment in time.
And it always seems like it's figure skating. I remember back when there was a judging brouhaha, years ago, and that got all overhauled. It just seems like, and maybe that's just because when I noticed it, but it's unfortunate for those skaters. And do they have a right to try to and like in a civil case, you'd be able to enter an appearance and represent your interest. Because I could foresee that if in fact there was a sanction here, that you'd want to delay that for as long as possible, right? Potentially, you want to delay that case. You want to move that case out, and avoid the imposition of that potentially, to when it might be convenient for you.
Sure.
For the other folks, they want a quick resolution to this because they want to know, what medal did I get, and or do I get one? And the other piece of this, and it sort of goes a little bit back to what I said before, which was the harm done. I believe that they probably thought that they were saving her from harm, but after witnessing, on replay, what happened to this young woman today, and just how much under pressure she must have felt, and how many times she fell. This morning I saw, it was the New York Times. They how bad does it have to be when the New York Times does an animated video of your routine to show when you fell and how many times you under rotated, or over rotated? So, obviously my colleagues in the press, I'm not necessarily impressed with that coverage, but the amount of pressure that this person was placed under, and at 15, so you can't have it both ways. It's sort of like you're almost guaranteeing a minor, who has lived in a protected bubble, part of a machine, because when you get to the elite status level, you're part of a machine, especially in Russia in particular. United States probably no different, but you're part of this machine, and and it's something has happened here, and you're carrying the weight of that, and now you have to go forward and you have to perform. Now she could have bowed out. There's been, back in the day, I think they would, strategically withdraw from competition when there was a positive result, but it just seemed like it wasn't fair to her to do that either. And so I guess your thoughts on that, and then also, is there a way for folks who had an interest in this matter to insert themselves into it because they want to move it along so that it doesn't get delayed? Because I understand this may take months.
Yeah, CAST cases can certainly take a significant amount of time, although it may be that we get a decision on this sooner because of its weight in the public sphere. To that end, I don't know that she would want to delay this necessarily, because the issue of disqualification of results for the team event is going to be at stake here, depending on her length of sanction and whether or not her legal team can make a successful argument as to if a violation is found, that she should be able to still keep her medal. I don't. There are some circumstances certainly where an athlete might strategically want to delay a hearing, but I don't know that that's the case here. I think she's already been, and I think this is the saddest part of it, is that as a 15-year-old girl, which she still is, albeit an elite athlete, she appears to be extremely traumatized by this whole thing. I didn't actually watch the routine where she fell, but it's my understanding that her teammate they panned to one of her teammates, and she could be seen uttering, I can't watch this, because it's just so painful and heartbreaking. It feels like there's no winners in this thing, right? And I don't, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. I think this is going to create a pretty remarkable set of jurisprudence to come, until WADA issues its next version of the code, or if it issues a comment to this provision of a protected individual. and what the intent is there. But yeah, I mean, it just it feels like one of those situations where no one is a winner, and yeah, I I think that's all there is to say about it.
Let me ask you one more procedural question that just cropped up in my head, and that is, WADA comes up with a code, right?
Mhm.
But they are also, in essence, the prosecutors of these violations,
Sure.
right? How does that work? I mean, does it strike you as sort of, and I understand why one would want to be an athlete's attorney. I mean, does it strike you that it's more heavily weighted to the other side, in light of the fact that they're the ones that are developing the code, they're the ones that are bringing the cases, they're the ones that are sending out, the officers to collect the samples. I mean, they're the ones accrediting these labs. It just seems very unequal.
I will say this from the biased perspective of someone who represents athletes. There are not enough athlete stakeholders making decisions about how the anti-doping movement is effectuated, and I think that's a huge problem. I will say that the code, it's reissued, um, not fairly regularly, but it when it is time for the new issue of the code to come out, it goes through a rigorous revision process and redlining process, which accounts for a lot of input from individuals like myself, individuals like Olympic committees, um, which includes, athlete advisory council representatives. It goes through commentary from various anti-doping agencies. I will say it didn't feel like this new version of the code had much incorporated in it that the athletes wanted to see, but um yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to and it seems like they're trying to take steps to create an independent ombuds position that's there as a representative and independent confidant for athletes to try and resolve some of these situations. um, but yeah, when you have this global entity making all of these decisions and rules and being the ultimate authority on who can appeal these decisions, there's bound to be conflicts and feelings of distrust and animosity from athletes, whether they're accused of doping or affected by a case of an accused doper.
There is so much to this area of sport, that I had no idea about. And if folks are interested in learning more, what are some sources of information that they can go to learn more? Because I have only, I think, glazed the surface of what you know. Clearly, as a lawyer that's doing this stuff every day, there is so much more that we can talk about, and I am mindful of your time and generosity.
Sure. There's there's lots of blogs on international sports law. Law and Sport is one that comes to mind. There's also, law firms like our firm, Morgan Sports Law. We publish blog posts that sort of give annotated versions of these cases and our thoughts on them. There's also the Court of Arbitration for Sport website. It publishes all of its decisions. And if you really wanted to take a deep dive into this jurisprudence and as you look at these decisions and they cite to different cases, what do those look like? That's all published and available online. And then, I would just say anti-doping is such a nuanced thing, and I appreciate when journalists try to get it right, but a lot of times they just sort of miss the mark on it and go towards the sensational facts of the case rather than the underlying law behind it. And so, I really appreciate getting the opportunity to share more details about what's going on with the Valieva case and also what international sports arbitration looks like.
The idea behind this show was that I wanted to be able to pick up where the news left off. And so I am very grateful that, that we did that tonight. Again, we only glazed the surface. I'm glad that athletes have attorneys and that they are excellent advocates at understanding the nuances of this system, because I practice in various areas of law that had nuances to them as well. And it's not that easy to get it, especially if you aren't an attorney. I'm working off of some knowledge, and so I'm picking up pieces here and there during our conversation and reading some of the things that I've seen published. But you're right, it is a very nuanced area of law, and so we need to be very careful about the stuff that we publish and that we produce, and so that we don't mislead people and we don't defame people. I appreciate the fact that you've given us some great resources. I would love to have you back another time to talk some more about this stuff, because undoubtedly it's going to come up again.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
But thank you very much, Lindsay Brandon. She is a attorney at Howard Jacobs Law Firm. Howard, I'm coming for you. You're going to be on my show too, buddy. I know you've got an Olympic emergency, but you're going to come visit. And I absolutely appreciate you coming and speaking with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to meet you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. I learned a lot tonight. I don't know about you guys. I did like an Uber show. And so I'll be brief in my comments here, but we reached out to the World Anti-Doping Agency, and they advised us, because the Valieva case was active, that they would be unable to appear, but provided us with a statement. That statement, in fact, is something that is already available, I think, on their website, but I will share it with you ever so briefly. And that they acknowledge that there was a ruling announced, that they would be appealing the decision. And that they expect that they're going to liaise with the laboratories in order to ensure that they expedite analysis of samples so that results are received prior to athletes traveling or competing in major events, such as the Olympics or the Paralympic Games, and where applicable, conduct results management of cases related to those athletes. And so there's more information contained in this statement, and I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to review it. So I am going to put it up on the places where we broadcast, so that you will have it. But it is long and well written, but long. And I also want to say that we also reached out to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and they were also unable to appear. So for all of my kvetching over the fact that the system looks unfair, folks seem to be behaving professionally in this system. This is very serious business, and the athletes take it seriously. When Ms. Valieva failed to medal as a result of a very poor performance, Johnny Weir exclaimed, "Thank God." Tara Lipinski said, "Thank goodness for all the medalists to have had that moment." Lipinski had said that. And, I have mixed feelings about that after having this conversation with Lindsay. This is a terrible situation for this young woman to have experienced, and we don't know how that substance got into her body. There's certainly some doubt in her story as to how she thinks it got there, but it got there, and there's going to be some sort of repercussion. I think the question becomes, is there more repercussions to come for other people? I don't understand why people take these risks that they do in these situations with the eyes of the world on them. I was never an athlete, so I can't identify with that need to win. As a lawyer, I wanted to win by doing the very best I could, and I sometimes didn't. And you deal with it. You lose. What's clear to me is that for all the effort that the World Anti-Doping Agency has put into regulating this area of athletics, it hasn't done enough. There are holes and gaps and an oversight that needs to be had. It's created a system of justice that is different for competitors in the same competitive event, and that's wrong. My mind has not changed about that. The fact that she's 15 and when you turn 16, you know, a different potential preliminary sanction would have happened, just in my mind is not okay. If you have the skill to be there, then you can face the consequences for breaking the rules like the other competitors, and you shouldn't be treated less severely. All athletes at the elite level are part of a machine. We learned that much with women's gymnastics. We had a women's gymnastics team that was highly dependent on its medical team, and that caused many of them a lot of damage. So age is irrelevant at this level. If you break the rules and you try to beat the system, or someone inadvertently helps you try to beat the system, and that is designed to create a level playing field for everyone, you should be treated the same way. It's unfortunate that the team medalists will have to wait to find out what medal they've really earned and receive it, depriving them of that moment. But I've learned a lot tonight, and I hope you have too. I want to thank my guests this evening, Dr. Martha Gulati and Attorney Lindsay Brandon, for joining me and helping me understand these issues. And I want to thank you for joining me this evening. I'm going to see you next week. But until then, I wish you a good night and a great tomorrow. Have a good one, guys.